You think you're prepared for marriage, for all the highs and lows that come with it. But nothing prepares you for betrayal. Emma and I had been married for 5 years, and it was starting to feel like we were barely keeping it together. A decade together in total, counting the dating years, but we'd hit a rut. I had noticed little things over time, her being more guarded with her phone, laughing at messages that weren't shared with me, a certain distance that grew between us. She blamed it on work stress, life, anything but the truth. Then one evening, it all unraveled. We were sitting at the dinner table, Emma stirring her food around her plate without much interest. The silence was heavy. I didn't feel like making conversation either. We'd had the same awkward meals for weeks now. But that night, she dropped her fork and looked up at me, eyes wide with the kind of terror you only see when someone's about to confess something devastating. "I've been seeing someone," she said, voice trembling. I didn't even blink. It's strange, the things you don't feel in the moment. There was no rush of anger, no sharp pain. Just a numbness. My mind went blank, then raced to catch up with the gravity of her words. "How long?" I asked, keeping my tone even. She hesitated, looking at the floor. 6 months. It started out as just flirting, but then it became more. The last word hung between us like an open wound. I could see she was waiting for me to explode, but I didn't. I just stared at her, feeling that numbness crawl through me. 6 months? Half a year of deceit, of lies. And I didn't notice. Or maybe I did and didn't want to face it. She looked at me, eyes glassy with tears, her fingers twisting the napkin in her lap. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I love you, but something's been missing, for a long time." Her words barely registered because something darker crept into my mind. Emma wasn't the only one who had stepped outside our marriage. I cleared my throat. "There's something you should know too." My heart pounded in my chest, the kind of beat that feels like it might break something inside. "I've been seeing someone too. For over a year." The words hit her like a slap. Her face went pale, eyes widening in disbelief. It was like she hadn't considered that I could be capable of the same betrayal. The hypocrisy of the situation was laughable, but neither of us was laughing. Emma gasped, her breath catching in her throat. "What do you mean?" "You." She stopped herself, tears spilling onto her cheeks as the reality of my words sank in. "How long?" "A little over a year," I said, my voice quieter now. "It wasn't serious at first, just a fling. But it kept going. I never stopped." For a few minutes neither of us spoke. The truth sat between us like a third person at the table, an ugly, unwelcome guest that neither of us knew how to deal with. There was no shouting, no dramatic breakdown. Just silence. We both knew we were to blame, that somewhere along the way, we had both given up on our marriage without admitting it. "Then what now?" she whispered. Her voice was soft, broken, and I could see the defeat in her eyes. That's when I made the suggestion that changed everything, though I never expected her to agree. "What if we just stop pretending this is working?" I said. "What if we have an open marriage?" I couldn't believe the words coming out of my mouth. Was I really suggesting this? I wasn't even sure what I wanted, but something in me was desperate for a way out, any way out. Emma wiped her tears, staring at me like I'd lost my mind. "An open relationship?" I nodded, not trusting myself to say more. She didn't respond right away. She just stared down at her hands, her expression impossible to read. The seconds felt like hours. Then, finally, she nodded. "Okay." The rest of the night passed in silence, both of us retreating into our own heads, processing the insane path we had just decided to walk down. I went to bed that night wondering if this was the beginning of the end. Or if it was the start of something we could control. Either way, everything was about to change. The awkwardness of the decision weighed on us for days, yet there was an odd sense of calm too. It was like we'd taken some pressure off the marriage. We didn't talk about what the rules of this open relationship would be, neither of us wanted to confront the messy details yet. Instead, we coasted in a weird, uneasy truce, each of us processing what had just been set in motion. I expected some hesitation from Emma after agreeing to it, but she surprised me. A week later, she came home and announced, with no real emotion in her voice, that she had told the guy she was seeing about our new arrangement. His name was Tom. The name didn't hurt like I thought it would. I guess knowing there was a real person involved made it less abstract, more manageable. "He's coming over tomorrow," she said casually, like she was mentioning a grocery run. "He wants to meet you." I stared at her, my hands gripping the edge of the kitchen counter. "Meet me?" She nodded, eyes steady, though I could see the nervous twitch in her hands. "We should be honest about this, right? No secrets anymore." I was floored. The guy I had pictured as this faceless stranger, this invisible threat, was suddenly becoming someone real, someone I was supposed to meet and be civil with. I wasn't ready for that. But then again, I wasn't sure if I was ready for any of this. And yet, I found myself agreeing. Fine. Emma went about her evening routine as if we hadn't just rewritten the entire script of our lives. I stood there, wondering how far this would go. Wondering if I'd be able to do the same. That night, I texted the woman I'd been seeing, Rebecca. I didn't tell her everything yet. I just told her that things had changed between me and Emma. Rebecca had always been distant, never prying into my personal life. But now, for the first time, I felt the need to pull her closer. The next day was surreal. I wasn't sure what to expect when Tom walked through our front door. He was younger than me, maybe by 5 or 6 years, with an easy smile that didn't quite match the situation. He seemed confident, like he was already comfortable in a space that used to be mine and Emma's alone. There was an undeniable tension between the three of us, but no one said it out loud. Emma looked at me, her eyes searching for some kind of approval, or maybe just reassurance. I didn't know how to react. Should I shake his hand? Pretend this was normal? So, I started, not sure where I was going with it. "This is weird, right?" Tom chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "A little, yeah? But Emma said this is what you both wanted." "Right," I muttered. My eyes darted to Emma, who looked like she was holding her breath. She had thrown herself into this, far more quickly than I expected. Maybe she needed to prove something to herself, or to me. "I think I'll get us some drinks," Emma said, moving toward the kitchen. I was left standing there, sizing up the man who had been sleeping with my wife for 6 months. Tom was polite, even kind, but there was no denying the strangeness of the situation. We were playing a bizarre game of civility while standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure of who would fall first. After Emma returned with wine, the conversation felt stilted, awkward, like we were all pretending this wasn't a complete disaster waiting to happen. At some point, I excused myself and went out to the backyard. The air was cool, and I could feel the weight of the tension lift, if only for a moment. As I stood there, I realized I hadn't really thought about what I wanted out of this. Was I doing this just to keep the peace? To avoid the inevitable end? Or did I truly believe that this could work? A minute later, Emma joined me outside, wrapping her arms around herself against the evening chill. "You okay?" I turned to her, wondering how we had gotten here. "I don't know. Are you?" She shrugged. "It's strange, but it feels different. Lighter." "Yeah," I said, though I wasn't sure I agreed. It wasn't lighter, it was heavier, dragging me down with every passing moment. But I kept it to myself. She hesitated before speaking again. "I know this isn't easy. But it's something we both wanted, right? To stop pretending." I nodded, not really believing the words. "Right." A few days later, I told Rebecca about the open relationship. She took it surprisingly well, better than I expected. She didn't ask many questions, just seemed to accept it. Maybe because we had never gotten too close emotionally. For her, this was just a continuation of something that was already casual. For me, it was something far more complicated. We met up that weekend, and it felt different. I had never felt guilty before, not really. But now, with Emma's lover so close to home, it all felt intertwined, like we were both playing some dangerous game, each of us with our own pieces on the board. Then Rebecca said something I wasn't ready for. "Maybe I should meet your wife," she suggested with a mischievous smile. It was meant as a joke, but I froze. The thought of introducing her to Emma, to letting these two worlds collide, it felt too close, too raw. "I don't know about that," I muttered, my mind racing. Rebecca raised an eyebrow but didn't push. She could sense the change in me. Maybe she always knew this was more complicated for me than it ever was for her. By the time I got home that evening, I found Tom's jacket hanging on the chair. He was over again. This was becoming a regular thing. I walked into the living room, and there they were, sitting together on the couch like some happy couple. Emma looked up, startled to see me so soon. I wasn't supposed to be home yet. "Hey," she said too casually. "I thought you were out with Rebecca?" "I was," I said, my voice tight. I didn't know why, but seeing them like that, so comfortable in what was once my space, made my stomach churn. I walked past them, trying to shake off the creeping feeling of loss. That night, as I lay in bed alone, I realized something unsettling. This open relationship wasn't creating freedom. It was building walls between us. And the more time passed, the higher those walls got. Days turned into weeks, and the strange arrangement Emma and I had fallen into started to feel oddly normal. Tom became a regular presence at the house, and Rebecca was never far from my thoughts either. But the freedom we thought we'd gained was only an illusion. Beneath the surface, cracks were forming. It wasn't just about sleeping with other people anymore. The emotional boundaries were blurring in ways I hadn't anticipated. Emma and I still lived under the same roof, but the house didn't feel like ours. It was divided into invisible territories, split between lovers and spouses, secrets and truths. Every glance, every word, seemed loaded with tension we weren't willing to address. Then came the night everything shifted again. Rebecca had been distant for the past few days, and I hadn't pressed her on it. Part of me was too wrapped up in my own tangled thoughts to care. That night, she showed up at my place unannounced, her eyes sharper than usual, like she had something she needed to get off her chest. "I've been seeing someone else," she blurted out, standing in the doorway. I stared at her, the words not fully registering. "What do you mean?" Rebecca crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe like she was trying to keep her distance. "Look, you're married. I know this whole thing with Emma is open, but I didn't sign up for any of this mess. I didn't realize it would get so complicated. So I've been seeing someone else." The room felt like it was tilting, my head spinning with the realization that I wasn't even in control of this part of my life anymore. I hadn't thought about what it meant for her to have someone else. For me, it was just Emma and Rebecca, my split world. I hadn't considered the idea that Rebecca might want more. I nodded slowly, trying to wrap my mind around it. "Okay. I guess I didn't think." "No, you didn't," she cut in, her voice harsher than I'd ever heard it. "You didn't think about how all of this might affect me. You've been using me as an escape from your messy life, but I'm not your backup plan, Ben." Her words hit harder than I expected. I couldn't even argue with her because she was right. That's exactly what I'd been doing, using her to avoid the disaster that was my marriage. And now, she was walking out of that disaster, leaving me to deal with the wreckage alone. "I'll be around," Rebecca said, her voice softer now. "But I don't think I can keep doing this." She didn't wait for me to respond before she turned and left, leaving me standing in the doorway with more questions than answers. That night, I didn't bother telling Emma about Rebecca. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of knowing things were falling apart on my end too. Besides, I didn't even know how I felt about it. Rebecca was never supposed to be a permanent fixture in my life, and yet losing her felt like another piece of control slipping away. Emma was in the kitchen when I walked in, humming to herself as she poured a glass of wine. She looked up when she saw me, her expression unreadable. I wondered how much longer we could keep pretending that this situation was sustainable. "You look off," she said, raising an eyebrow. "Rough night?" I almost laughed at the absurdity of her question. Rough night? That didn't even begin to cover it. but I just shrugged. Rebecca ended things. Emma's face flickered with something, sympathy, maybe, or relief. I'm sorry. Are you? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a sip of her wine, her eyes fixed on the floor. I didn't think this would be easy for either of us, Ben. But we made this choice, didn't we? Did we? I shot back, frustration bubbling up inside me. Or did we just stumble into it because we were too scared to face the real problems? Emma didn't respond. She just looked at me with those tired eyes, like she was as lost as I was. And maybe she was. But that didn't make it any easier to bear. I walked past her, heading upstairs to the bedroom. But when I got there, I found Tom's jacket draped over the chair, his shoes by the door. My heart sank. Without thinking, I turned around and walked back down the stairs. He's here again, isn't he? Emma stiffened. Yeah, he's in the living room. I stood there, seething, every fiber of my being wanting to storm into that room and drag him out. But what right did I have? This was the arrangement I'd agreed to. This was the mess I'd helped create. I can't do this, I muttered, mostly to myself. What do you mean? Emma's voice was small, unsure. I mean, I can't keep pretending this is okay. That this, I gestured vaguely to the house, to the rooms we barely shared anymore, is going to fix anything. She set down her wine glass, eyes wide with something like panic. What are you saying? You wanted this too, remember? We both agreed. I know what I said. I cut her off. But this isn't working, Emma. We're not fixing anything. We're just breaking it more. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. I could see the walls between us now, taller than ever, more solid than they had been before. And behind those walls were all the things we weren't saying, all the resentment and guilt we were burying deeper with every passing day. She didn't argue. She didn't fight back. Instead, she just stood there, staring at me, waiting for something to change. But nothing did. The next morning, I woke up to an empty house. Emma was gone. Tom too, I assumed. For a brief moment, I thought about calling her, asking where she was. But then I realized it didn't matter. Not anymore. I spent the day walking around the empty house, trying to piece together how everything had spiraled so far out of control. I knew there was no going back to the way things were before, but I wasn't sure what the future looked like either. The open relationship had been meant to save us, to give us both the space we needed. But it had only pushed us further apart. That evening, Emma came home. She didn't say much, just slipped quietly into the house, her face drawn and tired. We avoided each other like ghosts, each of us haunting different parts of the home, pretending not to notice the other. It wasn't until the following weekend that the real fracture appeared. Emma came to me one night, her face pale and her hands trembling. I need to talk to you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I sat up in bed, instantly on edge. What's going on? She swallowed hard, her eyes darting around the room like she couldn't bear to look at me. Tom wants to move in. The words hit me like a freight train. Move in? I stared at her, unable to comprehend what she was saying. Are you serious? She nodded, biting her lip. He thinks it's the next step for us. And honestly, I don't know. Maybe he's right. I felt the ground shift beneath me, my entire reality tilting on its axis. The idea of Tom moving in, of him living here, in the house we had built together, was more than I could handle. I could feel my hands shaking, my chest tightening with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Emma, this is insane, I said, my voice barely controlled. You can't seriously think that having him move in is going to make anything better. She didn't respond, and that was answer enough. The idea of Tom moving in felt absurd, but as the days passed, it became clear that Emma wasn't going to back down. She had dug her heels in, convinced that this was the logical next step for them. The arrangement I'd once seen as temporary was quickly turning into something far more permanent, and I had no idea how to stop it. 2 weeks after that conversation, Tom moved in. He didn't bring much, a few bags, a suitcase, and some personal belongings. But it was enough to make the house feel claustrophobic. I tried to keep my distance, staying out of the house as much as possible. Rebecca was gone, and the only place that felt remotely like home now was my office. I buried myself in work, but every night I came home to see Tom's shoes by the door, his jacket on the couch, his presence everywhere. At first, I thought I could handle it. I convinced myself that this was just another step in the open relationship, that this was something I had agreed to. But it wasn't long before the tension between us became unbearable. It wasn't that Tom was a bad guy. He wasn't. In fact, that made it worse. He was polite, tried to stay out of my way, and even made small talk when he could sense the awkwardness. But I couldn't stand the sight of him. Every time I saw him sitting at the dinner table with Emma, every time I heard them laughing in the other room, it was like a knife twisting in my gut. This was my house, my wife, my life, and yet it wasn't anymore. Things came to a head one evening, about a month into this new living arrangement. I walked in after work, already tense from a long day. The house was unusually quiet, but as I made my way to the kitchen, I saw them, Emma and Tom, sitting together at the table. They were talking softly, heads close together, their hands touching lightly as if the world outside didn't exist. I stopped in the doorway, something inside me snapping. "What the hell is this?" I blurted out, my voice harsher than I'd intended. Emma jumped, pulling her hand back like she'd been caught doing something wrong. Tom looked up, his expression calm, though I could see the unease in his eyes. "We're just talking," Emma said quickly, but her voice trembled. "Talking?" I repeated, my chest tightening with every word. "This is what we've come to now? You're playing house with him while I'm stuck living in some nightmare version of my life?" Tom opened his mouth to say something, but I cut him off. "Don't. Just don't." Emma stood up, her face flushed with a mixture of guilt and anger. "Ben, you knew what this was. We agreed to this." "No," I said, stepping closer. "I agreed to try an open relationship, not to let my wife's lover move into my home and take my place at the table." Tom stood now too, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "Hey, I'm not trying to take anyone's place. I'm just... I don't care what you're trying to do," I snapped, my voice rising. "You shouldn't be here. This isn't your home. This is..." Emma's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Ben, stop." I froze, the sharpness of her tone startling me. She was standing there, eyes blazing, more furious than I'd ever seen her. "We agreed to this," she said, her voice quieter but filled with steel. "You agreed. You wanted this open relationship just as much as I did. Don't turn this into something it's not." I stared at her, my anger boiling beneath the surface. "This isn't what I wanted, Emma. I wanted a way to fix us. But all this is doing is tearing us apart." Her face softened for a moment, the fury fading into something sadder, more broken. "Maybe we were already too far gone." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stood there, reeling, trying to process what she just said. Was that it? Were we really too far gone? Before I could respond, Emma turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there with Tom. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the air between us thick with tension. Then, without a word, he picked up his jacket and left the house. For the next few days, things were tense. Emma and I barely spoke, and Tom didn't come over for a while, though I knew he wasn't gone for good. The silence in the house was deafening, like we were both waiting for the other to make the next move. But neither of us did. Then, one night, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Rebecca standing on the doorstep. She hadn't reached out since we'd ended things, and seeing her now, standing there with a suitcase in hand, threw me off balance. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. I stepped aside, letting her into the house. She glanced around, her eyes lingering on the familiar details of the place. The awkwardness between us was palpable, but she didn't waste any time. "I need a place to stay," she said, setting down her suitcase. "Things with the other guy didn't work out. And I thought, maybe we could try again. Maybe something more." Her words hung in the air, and I felt a strange mix of emotions rise inside me. A part of me wanted to say yes, to let her back in and pretend that we could make something work. But another part of me knew that this wasn't the solution. Still, I found myself nodding. Okay. You can stay. Rebecca moving in changed everything again. The house was no longer just a battleground between Emma and me. It became a strange, uncomfortable mess of 4 people living under the same roof. Tom came back, of course. He and Emma resumed their odd, unsettling routine, while Rebecca and I tried to pick up where we left off. But it wasn't the same. Nothing was. There was no sense of intimacy anymore. We were just coexisting, each of us trying to navigate this ridiculous, unsustainable situation. It felt like some kind of twisted experiment, where none of us knew the rules or how it was supposed to end. The nights were the worst. Knowing that just down the hall, Emma and Tom were together, while I lay next to Rebecca, barely able to sleep. Sometimes I would hear them laughing, or worse, hear nothing at all, and my mind would race with the possibilities. Rebecca tried to distract me, but it was no use. The whole house felt like it was closing in around me. One evening, we were all in the same room, something that rarely happened. Emma, Tom, Rebecca, and I sat in the living room, the air thick with awkwardness. No one was speaking, no one was making eye contact. It was painfully clear that we had reached a breaking point. Tom was the first to stand up. "This isn't working," he said, his voice heavy with frustration. "I think we all know that." Emma flinched but didn't argue. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably beside me. Maybe it's time to rethink all of this." For the first time, no one tried to defend the arrangement. No one tried to justify what we were doing. We had all come to the same conclusion: this wasn't freedom, this wasn't salvation. It was chaos, and it was destroying us. But the question remained, what the hell were we supposed to do now? The tension in the house was unbearable. Every day felt like walking on broken glass, each step more painful than the last. No one talked about the elephant in the room, that this experiment was failing. We all just went about our routines, pretending not to notice the slow-motion collapse. Tom and Rebecca didn't leave, but they weren't really there either. The unspoken truth hung over all of us: this wasn't working. The open relationship, the attempt to fix something that had been broken for so long, had only made it worse. But instead of admitting that, we buried it deeper. One evening, I came home later than usual. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. I noticed Rebecca's things were gone, her suitcase, her toiletries, everything. A sinking feeling hit me. She hadn't mentioned anything about leaving. I found Emma sitting at the dining table, staring blankly at her phone. She didn't look up when I entered. "Where's Rebecca?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "She's gone," Emma said flatly. "She left this afternoon." "Why?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. Emma shrugged. "She said it was too much for her. All of this. It wasn't what she signed up for." I stood there, absorbing her words. Part of me felt relief. Rebecca leaving simplified things in a way, but another part of me felt the weight of abandonment. She had walked out without a word, without a fight. "Tom's gone too," Emma added quietly, her voice softer now. "What?" I turned toward her, confused. "When did he leave?" "This morning," she said, finally looking up at me. "He didn't want to do this anymore. He said it wasn't healthy." "He's right." I leaned against the wall, processing everything. Rebecca and Tom were gone, and all that was left was the wreckage of our marriage. The weight of what Emma and I had done, what we had allowed, hit me all at once. We'd invited chaos into our home, and now the fallout was here, leaving us more broken than we had ever been. Emma stood up and walked to the window, staring out into the night. "What are we doing, Ben?" she whispered. "What the hell are we doing?" I didn't have an answer. All I had were the shattered pieces of our lives. "We thought this would save us," I said, almost to myself. "We thought opening up the relationship would fix the cracks, give us the freedom we needed. But it just destroyed us," she finished, her voice tight with emotion. For a moment, we just stood there, the silence heavy between us. It felt like the end. Maybe it was. That weekend, Emma suggested we take some time apart. The house felt suffocating, like it was holding on to all the bad energy we'd created. We both needed space to think, to breathe. So, I packed a bag and left. It felt like running away, but I didn't care. I needed to be anywhere but there. I stayed at a friend's place, but I barely slept. My mind raced with everything that had happened. I kept thinking about the moment it all started, the night Emma confessed her affair. How quickly everything had spiraled out of control from that point. We'd both been so desperate to find a solution, but the truth was, we'd just been avoiding the real problem, us. By Sunday evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I drove back to the house, ready to confront whatever was left of our marriage. When I walked in, the house was dark, the air thick with the kind of silence that feels too loud. Emma was sitting on the couch, her knees pulled to her chest. She looked up when I came in, her face drawn and tired, like she hadn't slept in days. "We need to talk," she said, her voice hoarse. I nodded and sat down across from her. "Yeah, we do." For a long moment neither of us spoke. It felt like we were standing at the edge of something, and whatever we said next would either push us off the cliff or pull us back from it. "I don't think we can fix this," Emma finally said, her voice breaking. "We've done too much damage." I wanted to argue, to tell her we could work through it, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, I knew she was right. We had both betrayed each other in ways we couldn't take back. We had invited other people into our marriage, thinking it would somehow make us stronger, but all it had done was show us how far apart we really were. "I don't know if there's anything left to save," I admitted, the words painful to say out loud. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. She just nodded, her face etched with sadness. Maybe we were never meant to make it this far. Maybe we just held on because we were afraid to let go." I felt a lump rise in my throat, but I swallowed it down. "Yeah. Maybe." We sat there in the darkness, neither of us knowing what to say. The weight of everything we had lost hung between us like a ghost. For the first time in years, there was no anger, no resentment, just sadness. Pure, raw grief for the relationship that had died long before either of us realized it. A few days later, we made the decision. It wasn't a dramatic breakup, no shouting or throwing things. We were both too exhausted for that. Instead, it was quiet, almost peaceful. We agreed to separate, to give each other the space we needed to heal, if that was even possible. Emma moved out first, finding a small apartment a few miles away. I stayed in the house, though it didn't feel like home anymore. Every room reminded me of what we had lost, of the choices we had made. I knew I would have to sell it eventually, but for now, it was easier to stay. The open relationship had given us what we thought we wanted, freedom, but in the end, it only magnified the cracks that were already there. It wasn't the other people, the lovers, that broke us. It was us. The lies we told each other, the truths we avoided, the distance we never addressed. A month after the separation, Emma and I met for coffee. It wasn't awkward, surprisingly. We talked like two people who had once loved each other, but who had grown into strangers. She looked happier, lighter in a way I hadn't seen in years. I wondered if I looked the same. "Do you regret it?" I asked her at one point, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. She thought about it for a moment, then shook her head. "No. I regret what we did to each other, but I think we had to go through it. To see how far we'd fallen. To understand that we couldn't keep holding on." I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I agreed. Part of me did regret it, regretted ever suggesting the open relationship, regretted not fighting harder for us before things got so bad. But another part of me knew that it was inevitable. We had been crumbling long before Tom and Rebecca ever entered the picture. As we left the coffee shop, I realized something. Emma and I had spent years building a life together, but sometimes, no matter how much you try to fix something, it's already broken beyond repair. We said our goodbyes, and I watched her walk away, knowing this was the end of our story. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel angry or lost. I just felt free. The house felt impossibly quiet after Emma left. The echo of her absence hung in every room. I'd been staying here alone for weeks now, but it still didn't feel like home. Nothing did. It was just a shell, the remnants of a life we had built, now crumbling around me. I went through the motions: work, sleep, repeat. Every day felt like a blur, and the solitude became suffocating. I thought I'd feel some kind of relief once it was over, once Emma and I made the decision to end things. But the truth was, letting go wasn't as freeing as I'd imagined. There was a heaviness to it, like losing a part of myself I hadn't realized was so deeply tied to her. I couldn't bring myself to sell the house just yet. I knew it was inevitable, but the idea of moving felt too final, too much like admitting it was all over. So I stayed. For now. A few weeks after Emma moved out, Rebecca called. Her voice was cautious, hesitant, as if she wasn't sure whether she was welcome in my life anymore. "I heard about you and Emma," she said, her words careful, tiptoeing around the obvious. "Yeah," I replied, not sure what else to say. There was a pause, the kind that stretches on for too long, where you know the conversation is going to take a turn. "I'm sorry, Ben," she said softly. "I didn't mean for things to get so complicated between us. I should have known better." I sighed, leaning back in my chair. "It wasn't just you. It was everything. The whole situation, none of it was right." "I know," she whispered. I don't know. I guess I thought maybe we could find some way to." I cut her off, not unkindly. "Rebecca, we can't. You were right to leave. This, whatever we had, it wasn't real. It was just an escape for both of us." Her silence on the other end confirmed what I already knew. We both had used each other to avoid dealing with our real problems. And now that everything had come crashing down, there was nothing left between us but a shared understanding of how broken we both were. "I wish you the best," I said quietly. "I really do." "You too," she replied, her voice barely audible. And just like that, another chapter closed. I started spending more time with friends after that. I needed to reconnect with people who weren't tied to the mess I'd made of my life. There was something comforting about being around old friends, people who knew me before everything fell apart. They didn't ask too many questions, didn't push for details. They just let me exist, which was all I could handle at the time. One evening, while out with a group of friends, I ran into Emma. It was the first time I'd seen her since we had coffee, and the sight of her caught me off guard. She looked different. Happier. Lighter. She was with a group of people I didn't recognize, and when she saw me, her face lit up with a small, genuine smile. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't tense. It was just, okay. I walked over to her, not really knowing what to expect, but feeling like I needed to acknowledge her presence. "Hey," I said, shoving my hands into my pockets. "Hey," she replied, her eyes bright. "It's good to see you." "You too." I paused, glancing at the people she was with. "You look well." She laughed softly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Yeah, I guess I'm doing better than I thought I would. How about you?" I shrugged, giving her a small smile. "I'm getting there." There was no awkwardness, no lingering tension. Just two people who had once shared everything, now standing on the outside of each other's lives, content with the distance. That night, I lay in bed thinking about Emma. Seeing her had stirred up memories I wasn't prepared for. I remembered how we used to be, back when things were simple. Before the affairs, before the open relationship, before everything fell apart. There was a time when we were just us. And for a moment I allowed myself to miss that. But I knew those days were gone. What we had wasn't coming back, and maybe that was okay. People change. Relationships evolve, and sometimes they break. But that doesn't mean they weren't real or worth it. Over the next few months, I slowly started putting the pieces of my life back together. I began seeing a therapist, something I should have done long ago. Talking about everything, about the affair, The open relationship, the collapse of my marriage, helped me make sense of it all. It didn't make it any less painful, but it allowed me to understand why things had happened the way they did. Emma and I weren't bad people. We had just stopped being the right people for each other. We both made mistakes, terrible ones, but those mistakes didn't define us. They were just part of the story, part of the mess we had to navigate. One afternoon, I got a text from Emma. It was simple, just a few words: "Thank you for everything. I hope you're doing well." I stared at the message for a long time, unsure of how to respond. In the end, I didn't. Some things don't need a reply. Some things are just meant to be left in the past. I sold the house a few months later. It wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. I had already let go of so much. Letting go of the house felt like the natural next step. It was just a building, after all, not a home anymore. I moved into a smaller place, something more manageable. It was quiet, but in a way that felt peaceful rather than lonely. I spent my weekends hiking, going out with friends, doing things I hadn't done in years. Slowly, I started to feel like myself again, not the person I had been with Emma, but someone new. Someone better, maybe. The open relationship had been a mistake. But it was a mistake I had to make to learn something important. Freedom doesn't come from escaping your problems. It comes from facing them, from being honest with yourself and the people you love. Emma and I had run from our problems for so long, but in the end, we couldn't outrun the truth. And that truth was that we weren't meant to stay together. But that was okay. We had loved each other once, and that love had been real. And even though it ended, I knew we had both walked away stronger. A year after the separation, I ran into Emma again. This time, it was different. She was with someone, a new guy, someone who made her laugh in a way I hadn't seen in years. And I didn't feel jealousy. I didn't feel anger. I just felt happy for her. We exchanged a wave from across the room, a silent acknowledgement of everything we had been through, and then we went our separate ways. As I walked home that night, I realized something. The open relationship, the affairs, the mess we had made, it had all been a part of the journey. But it wasn't the end. There was life after the wreckage for both of us. And maybe that was the real lesson in all of this. Sometimes things fall apart. And sometimes they fall apart for a reason. After the dust settled, the hardest part wasn't losing Emma. It wasn't selling the house, moving on from Rebecca, or even the guilt that weighed on me every time I thought about how things had ended. The hardest part was forgiving myself. The regret seeped into everything. Not just for what had happened, but for who I had become in the process. I spent so much time looking back, replaying every decision I'd made over the past few years. What if I'd handled things differently? What if we hadn't gone down that twisted path? The endless what-ifs were a suffocating weight, dragging me back into the past when all I really needed was to find a way to move forward. Therapy helped with that. My therapist kept reminding me that everyone makes mistakes, that everyone carries their share of blame in a failing relationship. But knowing that intellectually didn't make it easier emotionally. I had betrayed Emma, and she had betrayed me. But the part that haunted me was how willingly I had participated in our self-destruction. One evening, as I was packing up the last of my things in the house before the final sale, I found an old photo of Emma and me. It was from our honeymoon, smiling, carefree, standing by the ocean like we had the whole world ahead of us. For a long time, I just stared at it, trying to connect that couple in the picture with the people we had become. They looked so happy, so untouched by the realities that would eventually break them. I sat down on the floor, still holding the photo, feeling a strange mix of nostalgia and sadness. I missed those versions of us, the ones who hadn't yet learned how hard life could get. But I wasn't angry anymore. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the weight of resentment. Maybe that was the beginning of forgiveness. A few weeks after moving into my new place, Emma called. I hadn't heard from her since that text she sent months ago, and the sound of her voice brought a wave of memories I wasn't entirely prepared for. But this time, it wasn't painful. It was just familiar. "Hey," she said softly. "I wanted to check in. How are you? I hesitated for a moment, then smiled to myself. I'm good, actually. Settling into the new place. That's good to hear, she replied. There was a brief pause, and I could tell she was choosing her words carefully. I've been thinking a lot, about everything. About us. And I realized I never really said sorry. Not properly. I wasn't expecting that. After everything we'd been through, we had both silently agreed to move on without reopening old wounds. But hearing her say those words, I'm sorry, was like lifting the final weight off my chest. You don't have to, I said quietly. We both made mistakes, Emma. I'm just as much to blame. I know, she said. But I still needed to say it. I'm sorry for what I did, for what I put you through. I wasn't fair to you, and I know that now. There was a time when hearing those words would have filled me with anger or made me feel vindicated. But now, all I felt was relief. Relief that we had both reached a place where we could let go of the pain, where forgiveness was possible. Thank you, I said. I appreciate that. And I'm sorry too. For everything. We talked for a little while longer, catching up on the small details of our lives, how she was doing, how I was adjusting to life on my own. It felt strange, but also comforting, like we were two old friends who had been through something big together and come out on the other side. We weren't the same people anymore, but we had both grown in ways we hadn't expected. When we hung up, I felt lighter. It wasn't a dramatic moment, but it was a turning point. Forgiveness wasn't something that happened overnight, but piece by piece, I was learning how to forgive Emma. And more importantly, I was learning how to forgive myself. The next few months were full of change. I threw myself into my work, spent more time with friends, and even started dating again, though nothing serious. It was strange, learning how to open up to someone new after everything that had happened. But I wasn't in a rush. For the first time in years, I was okay being by myself. Emma and I stayed in touch, but it was sporadic. We didn't need to talk often. When we did, it was light, easy. There was no lingering tension, no unspoken bitterness. It felt like we had finally reached a place of peace. One evening, I ran into her at a mutual friend's party. She was there with a new guy, someone I hadn't met before. They seemed happy together, and I couldn't help but smile. It didn't hurt to see her with someone else. It didn't make me feel jealous or bitter. If anything, it felt like closure. Later in the evening, Emma and I found ourselves alone for a few minutes, standing by the back patio as the party carried on around us. You look happy, I said, nodding toward her new boyfriend. She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. I am. I didn't think I would be, after everything, but I guess we both found our way, huh? Yeah, I said, feeling the truth of it. I guess we did. There was a comfortable silence between us, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel any tension. Just calm. Do you ever think about it? She asked suddenly, her voice softer now. About what happened? I shrugged. Sometimes. But not like before. It feels like another lifetime. She nodded, her gaze drifting to the sky. I think we both needed to go through it, as terrible as it was. To get here. Yeah, I agreed. It wasn't easy, but I think we're both better for it. She turned to me, her eyes warm with a kind of understanding that only comes after you've been through hell with someone. I'm glad we made it through, Ben. Even if we didn't make it together. I smiled, feeling the weight of her words settle over me. Me too. That night, as I drove home from the party, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. Forgiveness wasn't a single moment, but a journey. And for the first time, I felt like I was at the end of that road. Emma and I had both been through so much, and while we hadn't survived it as a couple, we had survived as individuals. We had found our way, even if it wasn't the way we had imagined. And maybe that was enough. Life after Emma felt like a clean slate. For the first time in a long while, the chaos was gone. The air felt lighter, and with every passing day, the weight of the past lifted off my shoulders. There was a certain clarity that came with the silence. No more late-night arguments, no more awkward dinners, no more pretending we could fix something that had been broken for years. As I settled into my new routine, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened, not with bitterness, but with understanding. I had spent so long trying to control the narrative, trying to hold on to something that was slipping away, that I never allowed myself to see things for what they truly were. The open relationship hadn't been the problem. The affairs hadn't been the problem. The problem had been us, two people who had grown apart but were too afraid to admit it. We had both been searching for something outside of our marriage to fill the void we felt inside it. But the truth was, that void had been growing long before anyone else came into the picture. One afternoon, I went for a hike. It was something I hadn't done in years, something I used to love before life got too busy. The trail was quiet, the kind of peaceful silence that makes you feel small in the best way. As I walked through the woods, I thought about the path my life had taken. I remembered the early days with Emma, how full of hope we had been, how sure we were that we could make it through anything. And for a while, we did. But life has a way of testing you, and somewhere along the line, we lost sight of what really mattered. The love was still there, but it had been buried under years of resentment, missed opportunities, and silent grievances. The open relationship had been our desperate attempt to find freedom, to break out of the suffocating cycle we'd fallen into. But instead of fixing us, it revealed the cracks we'd been avoiding. It wasn't the solution, it was the catalyst that forced us to confront the truth. As I reached the top of the trail, overlooking the valley below, I realized something important. The real freedom didn't come from opening up our marriage or seeking out new people. It came from letting go. Letting go of the past, letting go of the mistakes, and letting go of the idea that things had to work out a certain way for them to be worth it. I had spent so much time holding on to the pain of the failed relationship, the guilt of my own actions, and the anger toward Emma's betrayal. But now, standing there, I finally understood that the only way to truly move forward was to accept it all, every mistake, every hurtful decision, every painful conversation. It had all been part of the journey. When I got back home, I felt lighter, like something had shifted inside me. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't carrying the burden of what if. I wasn't dwelling on the past or questioning the choices I'd made. I was just here. Present. I sat down in the small living room of my new apartment, looking around at the space I now called home. It wasn't much, but it was mine. And it was enough. A few days later, I got an email from Emma. It was short, just a couple of lines. She wanted to let me know that she was moving in with her new boyfriend. She said she hoped I was doing well and that she wished me the best. I read the email twice, then smiled. I didn't need to respond. There was no lingering resentment, no urge to reopen old wounds. I was genuinely happy for her. We had both found our way forward, and that was all that mattered. Months passed, and life settled into a new rhythm. I went on a few dates here and there, nothing serious, just enough to remind myself that I was capable of connecting with someone again. But I wasn't in a rush. For the first time, I was content with being on my own. I spent more time with friends, rekindling old relationships I had neglected during the turmoil of my marriage. I threw myself into work, but not in the obsessive way I had before. Now I worked because I enjoyed it, because it gave me purpose, not because I was trying to escape. And in those quiet moments, when I was alone with my thoughts, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known in years. One evening, I found myself looking through old photos, snapshots of Emma and me from a time when things were good. I didn't feel the sharp pang of loss I used to. Instead, I felt gratitude. Gratitude for the time we had shared, for the lessons we had learned, even for the mistakes we had made. I had loved Emma, and she had loved me. That love had been real, even if it didn't last forever. And that was okay. Not all love stories are meant to go the distance, but that doesn't mean they weren't worth telling. I thought about the man I had been during our marriage, the mistakes I had made, the things I could have done differently. But more than that, I thought about the man I had become since. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had led me to a place of clarity, of peace. I didn't regret the open relationship. It had been a painful experience, but it had also been a necessary one. It forced Emma and me to confront the truth about ourselves, to face the reality of who we were and what we wanted. And in the end, it had given us both the freedom to move on. A year after the separation, I ran into Emma again. This time, it didn't feel like running into an ex. It felt like seeing an old friend. We chatted briefly, exchanged a few pleasantries, and then went our separate ways. There was no tension, no awkwardness. Just closure. As I walked away from that encounter, I realized that the journey I had been on, the painful, messy, complicated journey, had brought me here, to this moment. And for the first time, I wasn't looking back with regret. I was looking forward. Forgiveness isn't a destination. It's a process, one that takes time and patience. I had forgiven Emma, and I had forgiven myself. But more than that, I had learned to let go. To accept that life doesn't always go the way you plan, and that's okay. The open relationship had been a chapter in my life, but it wasn't the whole story. It was just one part of a much bigger journey, a journey of growth, of healing, of finding my way back to myself. And now, standing on the other side of it all, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, hit like and leave a comment with your favorite part. We'd love to hear your perspective.